Tensions between the Reserve Bank of India and the government have frankly existed almost in all regimes. The difference this time around seems to be that it's come out into the public in a very ugly fashion, partly perhaps because of both sides not being willing to communicate on some of these contentious issues. Joining us to talk about what's really going on and also how it should be resolved best, Professor T.T. Mohan, Professor of Finance and Accounting at IIM Ahmedabad, veteran watcher of the financial sector. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us here on Bloomberg Quint. My first question to you is this. There are always points of friction between the RBI and the government. Many of them get resolved, relatively amicably through discussion. This time around, it does seem a little bit more ugly. So your first thoughts as to what you think has led to this and whether both sides are sort of handling this a little badly?
Well, it is a bit of a mystery to me because the issues that have been flagged in the Deputy Governor's speech are not such as to warrant the kind of controversy that we are having. Now, I've been reading all sorts of things in the media, including a report about the proceedings of the last board meeting. And there are indications to the effect that some of the directors nominated by the government were very strong in their expression of their views, and that has riled the RBI top brass. But I have no means of commenting on any of that. There is nothing in the issues that have been flagged that cannot be amicably resolved with a little bit of give and take on both the sides.
Mohan, exactly. Let me ask you, there are four issues that everybody is talking about. Two of them are banking specific. One which is this PCA norms, the prompt corrective action norms. And one in the past, there were the issues of, the February 12th circular, etc. On those banking issues, these are fairly routine issues, not something that that should be extended into an independence of the RBI. We've always had this problem of 70% of the banking sector being with the government, and hence there are constant run-ins between the government and the regulator on regulation of PSU banks.
Yes, one thing we have to be clear about is that if the government makes suggestions or provides inputs on matters of concern to itself, such as the infusion of greater liquidity into the system, that cannot be construed as interference with the independence or undermining of the autonomy. The government has every right to air its views, whether through its officials or whether through the nominee directors. The nominee directors, of course, are on their own. But if they echo some of the government's concerns, or if the government's own representatives, the two finance ministry officials, air the government's concerns, or they want to make some suggestions, that cannot be construed as interference with autonomy. Only if the government issues clear directions which are in conflict with the positions of the RBI can you say that there is an attempt to interfere with the autonomy of RBI.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that on that February 12th circular, when it came down to issuing directions, the government actually backed off. So they haven't done so. Perhaps, Professor Mohan, the more contentious issues are the issue of the payment regulator, taking that outside the purview of the RBI, and then the issue of the RBI's reserves, which certainly seems like it would warrant a public airing of discontent from the regulator's end.
Yeah, so on about the payment regulator, what we are having is a discussion about the scope of the central bank's activities. Now, we've had similar discussions in the past when there was an attempt to take the public debt management function out of RBI that was given up. And then there were questions raised about the regulation of the primary market for government securities, whether it should be done by RBI or by SEBI. That discussion has also been given up. But whenever these discussions come up and questions are raised about the scope of RBI's activities, again, that cannot be construed as interference with the autonomy of RBI. Once a certain domain has been assigned to RBI and the RBI takes decisions within that domain, and somebody tries to interfere with that, only that is really interference with autonomy. So if in the case of the Bank of England, the regulatory function was moved out of the Bank of England and into the Financial Services Authority before the financial crisis. After the financial crisis, it was moved back into the Bank of England. So when this function was moved out, and neither when it was moved out nor when it was moved back, was it construed as interference with the autonomy of the Bank of England? So the discussion about what functions the RBI should be engaged in is a much larger debate on which the government is entitled to have its point of view. I respect the RBI's position on payments regulation. I do believe that on balance there is a case for payments to regulation to stay within the RBI. But just because the government has brought it up, again, I think it's a bit too much to say that it's in any way undermining the autonomy of RBI.
And the last issue of reserves, Professor, that seems to actually perhaps be the most serious. We don't know that if the government is actually going ahead with either changing the dividend policy or trying to get into the capital base of the central bank and withdraw some of that. But should that happen, I think that perhaps warrants a concern about independence?
Well, again, it's possible for RBI and government to sit down and determine the appropriate level of reserves for the RBI. There are two types of reserves, the revaluation reserves and then the profits that are flowed back. Obviously, the revaluation reserves cannot be touched because, just as they go up, they can also go down. And therefore, the real argument can be about the contingency reserves which they have, which they come out of profits of the Reserve Bank of India. And so there you can have a discussion on what is a comfortable level of reserves which the RBI should be having. And again, this is not something that warrants any huge controversy. And here again, I'm not aware that the RBI, the government has given directions to RBI saying that you should transfer out so much or anything to that effect. So I'm really unable to understand the very strong response which is coming from RBI. It could be that things are happening behind the scenes which you and I are not aware of. But otherwise, it doesn't seem to warrant the present level of controversy.
Okay. Professor Rahman, I want to get your thoughts on the issue of the RBI board, which you sort of alluded to earlier. It's this strange creature. If you go into the RBI Act, it gives it very wide powers. It doesn't preclude it from being a voting body. Yet, there hasn't been voting and we don't have any formal agenda or any formal set of issues that the board can weigh in on. What is your sense of how this board has morphed from being at times just a pure discussion body to at times being a pressure chamber of sorts?
Well, we are, from what I've read, we are seeing some very active discussions on the board. And I think that is to be welcomed. Passive boards are boards that are not really performing their function. So wherever there is active debate, and people are raising issues and raising concerns, I think that is entirely to be welcomed. Now, as to whether the board will exercise the powers which it theoretically enjoys, the papers which it enjoys, the powers it enjoys on paper, that's a different matter. The convention has been for the board to by and large, not act as a decision-making body, but more as an advisory body. But in certain circumstances, if the board members feel that something should be put to vote, that, as you rightly pointed out, is permitted by the RBI Act. And we should not be overly concerned if it happens. I mean, there could be exceptional circumstances where there is disagreement and where the board members feel that there is a case for voting. Now, that's perfectly all right. I mean, I would think that's a very democratic way of functioning.
Absolutely. But then, Professor, should there not be a little bit more clarity on the way this board functions? For instance, why not have agendas? Why not have a clear set of issues that the board can and cannot look into? Why not then have voting? And then, for instance, in the case of demonetization, it went through the board from all accounts. Something like the reserves will probably go through the board on all accounts. And then certain members of the RBI board should be allowed to perhaps, dissent, and that should be out in public domain. A bit more sunlight on the functioning of the board is essentially what I'm asking.
Well, whether the views expressed on the board should be made public, I'm not very sure, because then again, there will be talk about this rift between government and the RBI or the members of the RBI, so we have more controversy. So I'm not very sure, whether the minutes should be made public or the individual voting should be made public, which as happens in the case of Monetary Policy Committee. we can sort of play it by the ear and let things evolve.
So I'll ask you a last question, sir. What would be your preference? I assume you would want this to get, sort of resolved. Somebody has to be the bigger person in this, sit down, have a conversation, because it's terrible for the economy at any time, particularly at this time.
Well, yes, I think there needs to be clarity on, people's understanding of what central bank independence is all about. I mean, there is independence, but it is independence within the framework or limits set by the government. In the case of monetary policy, an exception has been made whereby statute certain powers have been delegated to the Monetary Policy Committee. But we have not had a similar dispensation in respect of all the other issues that are being talked about, whether it's regulation or the use of foreign exchange reserves and so on. By statute, all these powers have not been delegated to RBI, and therefore it follows that any decision making can happen only through a consultative process, and neither side can assert that its own position must necessarily be accepted by the other side. Government should not do it, and RBI should not do it. They should sit down and resolve it. And as I said at the very outset, there is nothing here which cannot be resolved through a consultative process.
All right, Professor Rahman, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much indeed for joining us on Bloomberg Quint to discuss this issue.